Today we're going to talk about in this session about the Saudi Arabia. We have four speakers. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Saad Al-Faqih, who's going to talk about the Saudi state, its politics, and the challenges to the Islamic project, followed by Dr. Abdullah Al-Auda, who's going to talk about the Islamic movement in Saudi Arabia, its successes and failures, followed by Dr. Saeed bin Nasser Al-Ghamidi, who is going to talk about the Islamic movement in Saudi Arabia, lessons learned and future prospects. The final speaker is going to be Dr. Yassin Aqtai, who's going to be talking about the external Saudi foreign policy towards Islamism and the Islamic movement. They would be followed by two commentators. The first is Dr. Isam Abdel-Shafi and the second is Dr. Amjad Jibril. Dr. Saad Al-Faqih, our first speaker, is the founder of the Islamic Reform movement, which is an opposition movement calling for a comprehensive change in governance in Saudi Arabia. He finished his degree in as a surgeon, as a physician and a surgeon, and he was a doctor in a main hospital in Saudi Arabia. But then he, since 1994, he worked as a full-time politician, and he left for the UK, and he has weekly broadcasts on social media and elsewhere to review the situation, interact with people, as well as to make observations and analysis. The second speaker is Dr. Abdullah Al-Auda, who is in charge of the Gulf section in Dawn, Democracy for the Arab World. Now, he was an associate professor in George Washington University and a fellow in Yaqeen Institute. He published a number of articles about Saudi Arabia and the Arab Gulf, and he regularly appears as a commentator in mass media in the West, and he also publishes articles in a number of newspapers. He also was a fellow in the Al-Walid Center for Christian Islamic Understanding for 2 years, and he was also a fellow to the law school in Yale University, and he received 2 degrees in law in comparative law. He also has a degree from Pittsburgh University about religious institutions and their impact on Arab states after the Arab Spring. Also, he has his BA from Al-Qasim University, and he is also the Secretary General for the National Party, which is the first political party publicly declared in Saudi Arabia. Our third speaker, Dr. Saeed bin Nasser Al-Ghamidi, is an academic and a researcher who graduated from Sharia University. He received his master's from a university in Riyadh in 1990 and his PhD from the same university in 1999. In the same year, he became an associate professor in the Faculty of Sharia, and then he became an associate professor in another university, and he also is a supervisor in the publication unit, and he also put together the methodology of a number of curricula. He has a number of publications, including books related to issues on doctrine and the origins of religion and of Islam, and he is the head of Sanad Association. Our fourth speaker, Dr. Yassin Aqtai, received his bachelor, master's, and a PhD in 1997 from the University of Ankara, after which he became a university professor, and he received his professorship in 2010, and he now teaches in Yildirim Bayezid University in Ankara. He also was an editor of the Tazkira magazine or journal, which is an academic journal in social and political sciences that was established in 1991. He was also member of the editorial committees of a number of journals for academic journals and university journals, and he established or sorry, directed, managed the Strategic Thinking Institute in Ankara for 4 years, and he was a former deputy of the AK party on external relations, and he has a number of books translated into a number of languages, including Arabic, Kurdish, and Turkish and English, and he regularly writes for Yeni Shafaq journal. Dr. Aysam Abdeshafi is the head of the International Relations Academy in Turkey, and he is a professor in Sakarya University in international relations, and he is also the manager of the Egyptian Institute for Strategic and Political Studies, and he was a professor in Egypt before he left Egypt, and the head of the research center in Qatar as well, and he published a number of researches and books, particularly about US and Egypt. Our final speaker, Mr. Amjad, has publications on the regional issues. One of his books was published by Al Jazeera Studies Center. He has a number of publications in academic journals. I'd like to welcome you all. We start with our first speaker, Dr. Saad Al-Faqih. You have 25 minutes. Please go ahead. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Praise be to Allah, and peace and blessings be to his prophet and companions. When we talk about the Islamic movement and the challenges to the Islamic movement in Saudi Arabia, this is a challenging subject to study, and I hope I managed to cover it, and also because it is challenging to prioritize which aspects or topics to focus upon. So I hope I would be successful in talking about this Islamic opposition movement. Since the framework of this dialogue or conversation is about Islamic movements in the region, then I believe it's important to look back at history, the history of Saudi Arabia, the current state of Saudi Arabia, and why is it called the third state? Why is its emergence significant? Because the understanding of the legitimacy and the nature of that state comes from its historical roots. The first Saudi state, many of you are aware of it. Of course, it appeared in the 18th century after an alliance between the Muhammad bin Saud and Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, and it lasted for about 60 years, and it governed most of the Arab Peninsula, reaching to places as far as Karbala in Iraq, and it was a state, an Arab state with a mission or a message. At the end of the day, regardless of your point, it had a mission. It was overthrown by the army of Muhammad Ali, but the most important thing, the political state fell, but the idea of the mission or the message and the human nature of the community persisted, and the next state was closer to an emirate around Najd and Al-Ihsa, and of course it had the religiosity and the religious commitment, not as a message but as a practice, and it lasted for a very short period of time, and it was many disagreements stormed this state, where we have more than 13 assassinations within And in between the Al Saud Saud family, um, and this state ended by the end of the 19th century at the hands of al-Rashid, and then in the 1900s we started the Al Saud project, and it culminated with the establishment of Saudi Arabia in 1932. The Saudi Arabia, and by the way, the title of the name of the state was a suggestion from the British. Abdulaziz bin Saud was unable to prevail over his rivals despite external support by the British, except when he used religion, because there were Idrisi, Al-Ajbani, and many rivals. But when he used religion, he was able to establish his rule. He did not use it quite effectively until he started a militia which helped him defeat his rivals. And when he started to push through the borders drawn by the British around Jordan, Iraq, or elsewhere, he stopped using the scholars and using the religious discourse and taking advantage of the ignorance amongst the rank of that militia. After he established his rule, he was unable to subjugate the the Saudi people until and establish his absolute power until he maintained a sort of the old alliance between the ruling family and religion. So the role of that militias and as well as the use of religion were the two factors that led to the persistence of Al Saud. Abdulaziz was keen on maintaining that alliance through his sons as well, so they should hold to absolute power, but let the people understand that you lead and you govern using Sharia. Make people and think that you rule by Sharia, and give the sheikhs or scholars venues, even if you run contrary to their opinions. People have to understand that you pay respect to those scholars. That was the recommendation of Abdulaziz, and his sons abided by that relatively. After the death of Abdulaziz, there were many challenges internationally which were dealt with based on an interest basis. But this alliance and those challenges led to the rise of Islamism more than they thought. One of those challenges was the rise of nationalism, Nasserism, and so they had to start with their own project. So they opened the floor for scholars, particularly those who were oppressed in Syria, Iraq, and Egypt. So the Saudi Arabia took use or made use of those minds and those scholars. These movements, such as the movement of the Muslim Brotherhood, a large number of whom moved to the Saudi Arabia at the time, were in themselves rivals to the nationalism and Nasserism. So there was an implicit, undeclared alliance between Saudi Arabia and those movements. So for that reason, as the Saudi regime contained those movements and gave them room to make impact on cultural, social, and religious terms, and to have certain positions. For example, Muhammad Qutb was in an important position in curriculum making with and many other figures that have impacted society and the community, and they also affected individuals. They did not only affect education and culture, but they affected many individuals. And based on that effect, we had many movements in the 60s where that are similar to the Muslim Brotherhood, and other were independent, and others were combination of Muslim Brotherhood and Salafi thought. And those movements were sometimes Wahhabi Puritans or part of the Muslim Brotherhood who brought the awareness and open-mindedness that they got from their uh, life outside the region. So they started a new combination, which is an understand a sense of internationalism, methodology, and openness to understand and open up to modern sciences. Had it not been for this combination, actually, maybe the traditional Islamic movement wouldn't have been able to face the challenges that came from abroad. What happened after that? In the early 1970s, before the death of King Faisal, there was a westernizing tendency in media and in social activities that culminated in 19 mm, by the end of 1970s and caused fierce reactions. So although that westernizing tendency took a hold by the end of the 1970s. At the time, Fahd ibn Abdul Aziz was the the actual ruler or de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. But most importantly, this coincided with two very important developments, causing 1980s to be a golden age for Sahwa. The first was the uh, um, Soviet army advent to Afghanistan, and the which made the Saudi Arabia allow a jihad not only in rhetorical terms but also in terms of mobilization, support, and culture. And the other thing was the Khomeini revolution at the end of the 70s, which caused a lot of embarrassment for the Saudi regime, as Al Khomeini was a successful, charismatic leader in the Shia realm, and Saudi Arabia was under the challenge of offering a parallel model of Sunni leadership. So they needed to offer that parallel. People who lived through that era would recall how uh, influential those developments were, so much so that many Sunnis were about to switch sides to the Shia side. And this caused the 1980s a golden age for the Islamic movement until we had the Gulf crisis. It was a shock. This state where the people had the impression that their ruler was affiliated with or most closely connected with Islam, and all of a sudden he was seeking the support of the Americans and bringing so many troops to the Arab Peninsula, and this crisis caused a complete turn of tables and changed the role and the relation between the state and the scholars, causing forcefully actually, or causing much change that actually destabilized the situation. Uh, First of all, directly or immediately after the crisis, and I believe Dr. Said would remember those details, it turned out that the official religious institution was a function of the state, and even the judiciary, although they had no say in this matter, they issued a statement adopting the seeking the help of the Americans. And also, the religious institution in the state wasn't clearly separated, so people would not call certain scholars as affiliated with the state and others as independent scholars. But this crisis showed the clear distinction between the formal institution of religious persons or religious scholars and independent scholars, and showed that the system of governance was totally dependent and totally unable to defend itself, although they spent billions of dollars on uh, weapons, and that the state was unable to do anything to protect itself. And it turned out that all the religious commitments of the state, which are related to the use of Sharia law and the not seeking the support of non-believers, etc., it turned out all to be nonsense. So this crisis not only divided the religious establishment into scholars who are independent and scholars who are pro-regime, it also added a symbolic value to some of the scholars, including Dr. Salman al-Auda. During this crisis, Sheikh Salman al-Auda and his colleagues, who were known before this crisis within religious circles, but after the crisis they became known for all the people, and they started to represent the approach that was rival to that of the authority. What happened afterwards? What happened is what we can see right now. During all of that history, we had no, since the establishment of the modern state of Saudi Arabia, there wasn't any Islamic opposition in the modern sense of the word of opposition. There was the Muslim Brotherhood, and we had the Jihayman, which is a rejectionist movement rather than a constructionist movement, which is based on a certain prophecy that they wanted to enforce or impose upon forcefully. But there were oppositions that were not successful because they had no constituency. So national and nationalistic or pan-Arab and communist oppositions were fiercely crushed, and no one even sympathized with them because they had no constituency. And after the Iranian Revolution, there was a Shia opposition, which echoed with only the Shia constituency. But after the Gulf crisis, we started to see a new declared program for Islamic opposition. So between 1990 to 1994, we had internal opposition that worked on the three steps. They offered a project during the Gulf crisis since the occupation, the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait until 1991. And there was a kind of spontaneity in and arbitrariness in the attitude, but in 1991 they started to have an organized approach to where they declared the 12 demands, and they were not simple demands such as the Shura or Consultation Council, reform of the reform of the media, improvement of the status of women, and we had 400 signatories, including scholars and university professors, etc. And in 1992, there it was issued the advice memo, which was in 40 pages to explain the 12 demands, which constituted a full program. So those who applied those memos and those demands, they realized the state would not want to implement those issues, but they wanted to raise the awareness of the people to understand that they have the right to ask for those legitimate demands, and that Islam cannot be monopolized only by the state and restricted only to official establishments. So it was, in a sense, a step to raise awareness more than anything. And then in 1993, the first public and organized action of the opposition was the establishment of the Committee of the Defense of Public Grievances. And although they said they're going to work within official judiciary channels, they were crushed. And again, the objective was not to succeed in that mission, but to train the people and make them understand that they can require those rights as long as they were not prohibited by religion, and the ruler cannot prevent you from having them. And then in the middle 90s, most of the opposition and its action came out, was exiled. And using telecommunication, they continued to work from abroad, but then we had, by the mid 90s, the jihadi movements, the operations in Riyadh, Al Khubar, and also in Tanzania and Kenya, and other incidents in Somal and in Adan. Even in terms of the literature was no longer restricted to the peaceful opposition, but it started to be used by a radical opposition, which started to, or jihadi operations or movements. This was influential to an extent, but it wasn't as too confusing for the people until 9/11. So between 1991 to 1994, we had opposition inside Saudi Arabia, and then in 1995 in exile, and then until the end of the 90s working from abroad. And then we had 9/11, and you know the how the world changed, and how the Saudi people started to be in the epicenter of the storm and had to deal with it on two fronts. First of all, that the government was terrified of being held responsible for this, and then another was this sympathy with jihadis. And so the government was confused whether to appease the West or the people. And what added to the confusion was the invasion of Iraq, and all of those events or developments, the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait, 9/11, and then the invasion of Iraq, all helped to delegitimize the Saudi regime and exposed it as an agent of the Americans, and putting religion at the end of its priorities, particularly that after the first Gulf crisis, it became hostile to scholars, independent scholars. It had In 1994, it arrested Dr. Salman Al Auda and along with 600 scholars as well. But at the time, we had King Fahd, who was one of the few from Al Saud who realized and understood the importance of religion to the Saudi people. So he would instruct the Minister of Interior not and others in charge not to leave those scholars for a long time in prisons, although some of them were imprisoned for 2 or 3 years, but they were then released. And the respect to scholars, there was an attempt to restore respect for the scholars. And as I said, with the invasion of Iraq, there was even further confusion, and the state was under pressure to strike a precarious balance. And Mr. Khalid al-Tuwaijri, who was the advisor of the king and who actually helped the rise of Mohammed bin Salman. This it was a westernized individual. This Khalid al-Tuwaijri was pushing in the westernized direction after the Iraqi war until the Arab Spring. We had what we called peaceful declared opposition known as Hassan, Dr. Qahtani, and Dr. Rahbani, and others who were active and who would gather publicly, and the presence of the atmosphere after the invasion of Iraq and after 9/11 made the authorities be cautious in terms of avoiding to crush them very fiercely. So they allowed a margin of movement until we had the Arab Spring, which provided more motive for further opposition. But then, with the counter revolutions and with the oppression crushing the Arab Spring, this oppressive approach was used in Saudi Arabia even before the advent of Mohammed bin Salman under King Abdullah, and then he died in 2015, and then we had King Salman, but actually de facto it was Mohammed bin Salman because Salman started dementia or Alzheimer's in 2013. So effectively, Mohammed bin Salman was the de facto king, and he started to reap the fruits of what the Al Saud did to Islamic scholars, and he also built on the westernized approach advocated by Khalid Tuwaijri. So Mohammed bin Salman didn't want to use any of the methods, the indirect methods that used by his precedents or and he introduced measures that were very shocking, and he imprisoned many of his family members and many of the scholars very more or less arbitrarily, and he started to speak publicly and explicitly in a way showing that he had let go of the Islamic approach or the Islamic project. So what happened was that people started not to think of the family as part of the fate of this country. Unfortunately, many peoples are raised up to think that a certain monarchy, a certain ruling family is a part of their fate. But then that was so people thought that their fate was to have the Saud family as the kings and monarchs of this land, and he ignored the scholars at all. He wouldn't even ask for their opinion or fatwa. So the regime uh, lost the power of scholars in uh, affecting the people. And this exposed not only the corruption of this regime, which allows festivals and exposure of women's bodies, etc. But it started to work on issues that were. Can you finish in 2 minutes, please? In terms of the future, in terms of the Islamic movement, I believe we may see a disagreement within the Saud family. They need to be prepared to deal with that, or they may face intervention from the Americans, or there could be international or regional developments that change the general atmosphere, or re-eruption of violence and assassinations and terrorist attacks, or finally, although this is unlikely, a popular uprising. Are there any oppositions apart from the Sunni opposition? Yes, we used to have the communist and the nationalist, and we still have the Shia, but with a limited constituency. So to conclude, the regime used to use religion in a formative manner to deceive the people into believing their uh, uh, closeness to religion, but it gradually eroded until the age of Muhammad bin Salman. And would the Islamic movement, with its independent figures and formations, it could can it make a reaction? They could, in principle, but whether they would be able to do so in practice, that's to be seen. Thank you so much, Dr. Saad, for your paper. Dr. Faqih has started his paper in talking about the elements and the relation between the Saudi regime and the Islamic movement or this Islamic opposition, and he talked about the history of the Saudi state and the so-called third Saudi state, and he said there is a history for the first state that was established under Muhammad at the time of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, and the grandfather of the Saud family, where the state was very much wide, with wide control reaching to Karbala in Iraq.
And it was in a part of Al-Aqsa, but it didn't continue for a long time because the adversaries of them, they started to work, and then the state was established by the support of the English, and they were unable to defeat the adversaries there. And after the establishing the militias of the Al-Ikhwan, the expansion of the state stopped. They were unable to control the people until they gave the power to the ulama and the respect for ulama. They didn't give real power, genuine power to the ulama. That's only used them as to get into the power. After Abdul Aziz, there was commitment to or holding to the to governance, especially at the time of the Nasri and the nationalist movements that started, and especially that some of the movements that left their countries because of the oppression, like the Muslim Muslim Brotherhoods who went to Saudi Arabia. There was an unstated alliance between these movements and the Al Saud for the social change, and those who came from outside, they affected the people, and we started to see new movements that were affected by the purity of the movement and the activism of those movements. In the beginning of the 70s, there was an westernized tendency in the state that was represented in or led to the to having extremist groups like Juhayman in the 1987 that stopped the westernization in the country. Then there was the awakening da'wah or the sahwa in Saudi Arabia, and that was after the success of the Al Khomeini revolution, especially that he was an austere leader that was leading by Islam, and the those who and those who were calling for a Sunni movement or a Sunni revolution that was accumulating until the Saudi Arabia sought the support of the United States after uh, the occupation of Iraq to Kuwait, or the invasion of Iraq to Kuwait. So bringing the Americans to the Al Hijaz land, it was seen unacceptable. So the crisis started with, and the crisis showed that the ulama of the authority were completely loyal to the authority, and this problem showed that there is a number of ulama who are affiliated with the authority and others who are independent, like Safar al-Hawali and Salman al-Auda. And after that, the Islamic projects became to appear as opposing to the authority. They were communist and liberal opposition, but they didn't have any popularity, and the Shia opposition was only in the eastern area. So after the occupation of or the invasion of Iraq, they started to be institutionalized with demands of reform, and there were a number of scholars who signed them, and the demands were in one page, and the explanation of the demands were in 44 pages in order not to be misunderstood. There were attempts afterwards to challenge the regime through the creating of the Council of Defending Their Rights, or the movements of uh, the opposition outside Saudi Arabia. The literature were not only for the reformist groups, they were also jihadi groups until the 9/11 events. So, in short, there was internal opposition between 1991 and 93, and then there was external opposition from 94 to 2001. After 9/11 events, there was a pressure on the regime. It was too strong, and they were confused because of the popular support after this events and the invasion of Iraq. So all of that uncovered the regime, and so the regime arrested more than 600 independent ulama and sheikhs at the time. Al-Tuwaijri, who was advisor to the king, he was a Western-oriented person. There was and afterwards, and after a lot of the activities that he made, there was the phenomenon of internal opposition, which is Hasm, was started to appear, and after the Arab Spring, the internal opposition started to be crushed, especially after Mohammed bin Salman, who came to as a prince crown or crown and prince, and he started to show activities that are secular and liberal, and he also imprisoned sheikhs and ulama, as well as members of the family. So this led to shake the prestige of the state and of the family. What is the future? There are different scenarios, either to have an internal dispute in the family, or to have an international pressure to change because of the events of Salman, the Major Salman is taking, or to have internal violence or an internal revolution or popular revolution. But the Shia opposition doesn't have any popular support if they are going to do so. In short, the use of the religion for the legitimacy of the regime is ended, and the situation requires a better or another strategy that is not available yet. Thank you very much, Dr. Sa.
مداخلة الدكتور عبد الله العودة فليتفضل.
Now we will. The floor is for Dr. Abdullah Al. Before Dr. Abdullah Al starts, thank you for your summary. But the arrest of the 600 ulama were in the 1990s, but not in after the invasion of Iraq. The rest, your summary was perfect. Thank you very much, Dr. Saad, and thank you, Dr. Sami. Your summary was great. I don't know if you are taking notes during the lecture or you have. If you are doing so, this is a rare skill. Thank you, Dr. Saad, because you took out the burden of speaking about the history. So I'm going to adopt or adapt some of the points in order not to repeat what has been already said, and to try to talk about other issues that were not mentioned. So talking about the relation between Islam and the state is an old relation, or at least that is the official narrative, that the establishment of the state, that there was this relation between Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab and the Saud family. What's happened is when we reached the third Saudi state, King Abdulaziz, it is known that he had two failed attempts to restore the third Saudi state. He failed because he was speaking about restoring the ownership or the king or the monarchy of his fathers and forefathers, and that's what is represented as the fanatism or ideologia. So in the third attempt he spoke about the praying the one God and the pure creed of Islam. And there are stories, and this is one story that I heard from my father and from his sheikhs. Sheikh Ibrahim Al Jasser, he was from Al Qasim, and he taught as Sa'di, and he was the sheikh of so many well-known sheikhs. So he's the Sheikh of Ibn Uthaymeen and other well-known sheikhs of the third estate. So Ibrahim bin Jasser had a very significant role for raising awareness in Al Qasim. So when Abdulaziz came to Al Qasim, his controversy or argument with Ibn Al Jasser was that you are a scholar and you know what and you see what the Turks are doing, and their Sufism and their shirk. Uh, so why don't you issue a fatwa that they are infidels, and how they have polytheism in their practice? So he wanted to create this momentum and to give some legitimacy to the fighting that he was leading against the Turks. When Ibn al-Jasir rejected, he went to Al-Ahsa, and this is the story of Ben Aqil, and he said that Al Jasser was poisoned, and he died because of that, because he rejected to call the Ottomans infidels at that time. And Abdulaziz found that he doesn't have any foothold in this area, in Al Qasim or in that area. So Al Jasser was poisoned at in that journey, and it is telling who was responsible for poisoning him. Dr. Saad mentioned or talked about the role of the Saudi state and the relation with others, the idea of also the loyalty and allegiance and the allegiance and devouing of the kafirs. So there are two sections. So there is a kind of a purity that is related to the relation with God without any mediatories, and in relation uh, with the religious texts. And the other aspect of that call was judging others who were different on the issues that they believe in. For example, the relation with the Sufis, the relation with the Shia, and even the relation within the Sunni current, that they have differences with it in different issues. So this discourse became the official discourse, and it's contributed to giving legitimacy to the state, also through the use of terminology and and concepts that are present in uh, this current, for example, the idea of the wali al-amr, or the guardian, and the principles of the sharia, and so on and so forth. uh, of course, some people see that within the Wahhabism there are two currents that they uh, um, that improved or developed alongside the one that is rejectionary, and the other one that was the legitimizing one. The legitimizing aspect or current was the one that was linked strongly with the authority or with the government, and they were giving the legitimacy for the dynamics of the issues. And the rejectionary aspect, they rejected a lot of the measures because they started to see that the nature of the work of this of this state is going in contradiction to the holy textures or texts and scripts. And part of them was the including those from the movement of Man Allah. Uh, so this discourse, uh, the discourse that they were using, it encouraged those militias of Manta Allah that to fight in the north and in Al Hijaz. But when they were, and they thought that they are going to do a lot of changes in Al Hijaz, but when they were prevented, the battle became genuine when the Battle of Spilla, when Abdul Aziz saw that those militias that he supported and that gave them the support, and that he taught them through the Wahhabi sheikhs, like for example, they opened for them the Hijr, or the centers for education, as they started to go out of control in the Spilla battle, and he eliminated them. Out of this battle, the religious discourse that was available was the one that is related to the dynamic of the state, which means it changes and adapts according to what the state orders. So this rejectionary aspect or current was defeated militarily, and was not accepted anymore. There was also the Salafi Muhtasibi movement, and there was some sheikhs had relation with this movement, and they started with the idea that the state started to be against of some of the things that it was adopting, or some of the things that Muhammad Abdul Wahab called for, and especially with the corruption that was happening, and with the current technology that was taking place, like uh, TV and radio and other things. So they got into a battle with the movement of Jhayman. The Jhayman movement was the development of the so-called the Muhtasiba Salafi movement. It has other names as well. So it was built on this issue, that there is contradiction with the implementation of Sharia, and so there was a serious need for the role of the ulama. At the time, there was a political difference with Al Saud, and later they were given some kind of legitimacy.
كان ضروري جدا لأجل تحاشي أن يتم وجود أي تيار رافض.
Institutionalizing the formal state, it was because the
من جهتها هي كما ترى هي
the state had a very problematic matter when after the speech or the call of the demands, the state found that one Sheikh bin Jibrin, who was the most significant figure in the association, they found that those people that are used by the authority, and they are the ones that are sympathizing with the state. So we started to see a new current that have an Islamic current. They are influenced by the thoughts of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab, but they are not related to the state. So
إنه بعد خروج كثير من شيوخ الصحوة الإسلامية ودعاة الصحوة الإسلامية من المعتقلات، حصل مراجعات أيضا في كثير من المفاهيم. أعتقد أنه يمكن أكثر في مراجعات سياسية وفي مراجعات ثقافية وأدب في الأدبيات. أظن أنه في مراجعات الأدبيات يعني هم ليسوا على يعني قدم سواء، يختلفون يتفاوتون في دورهم وفي فهم كثير من المواقف، لكن ربما العلاقة مع ثلاث أشياء هي أصبحت محل المراجعات ومحل الجدل. العلاقة مع الآخر اللي هو الغرب دوليا، اللي هو محليا، الطوائف المختلفة، التيارات المختلفة، العلاقة مع المجموعات المختلفة داخل الوطن الواحد. هذه كانت محل جدل ومراجعات الكثير من شخوص هذا التيار. الشيء الآخر العلاقة مع المرأة أيضا، أنه حصل هناك فهم معين في العلاقة مع المرأة ودورها اجتماعيا، وهل يمكن أن تعمل، هل يمكن أن تمارس مثلا يكون لها دور سياسي، هل يمكن أن يكون لها دور ثقافي، هل يمكن أن يكون لها دور فقهي، هل يمكن أن يكون حصل جدل أيضا داخل هذا التيار في هذه المسألة ومدى دورها. والمسألة الثالثة الصراع بين فكرة ما يسمى التشدد مقابل ما يسمى التيسير، أنه هناك مراجعات للصحوة، أنه هناك فيما يتعلق بالفقه كثير من المسائل هناك فقط رأي واحد، قول واحد هو اللي أصبح هو القول الحقيقي، أو يعني هو الراجح عند ناس أو مجموعة أو ناس معينين، أصبح هو الرأي الوحيد والسائد. وصارت إشكاليات بسبب ارتباط الدين نفسه والخطاب نفسه، ارتباط الخطاب نفسه بهذه المعطيات وبهذه الآراء الفقهية الفرعية. طبعا حصلت مراجعات وحصلت تطورات وطلعت بيانات من داخل أيضا من بيان التعايش إلى بعدها تطورت عدة بيانات، ولكن أظن أنه اللي اقتطف فكرة وحول هذا الخطاب إلى خطاب يعني شامل فيما يتعلق بعلاقة الدين ومفهوم الدين الذي كانت يوم من الأيام تحتكره الدولة، وتحاول الدولة أن تقول بأنه هو الدور، وخصوصا فيما يتعلق بالمفاهيم السياسية. ربما حركة حسم، ودعنا نقول الدكتور الحامد تحديدا، لأنه له جهود مبكرة حتى قبل الحركة، قبل تأسيس حركة حسم، له جهود مبكرة في أيضا المفاهيم الدينية ومحاولته تطويرها في أكثر من صعيد، منذ كتاب حكام الإسلام بين غبش الطغيان، وكتاب يعني الكتب المبكرة، ثم الكتب اللاحقة التي طورها في مفاهيم كثيرة تتعلق بمفهوم فكر الحامد وزملائه. يعني أتى إلى المفاهيم المتاحة إسلاميا ودينيا، وكانت تستخدمها الدولة وشخوص، ويستخدمونها شخوص الدولة ومؤسساتها الرسمية لأجل تبرير وشرعنة الوضع القائم، إلى استخدام هذه المفاهيم لأجل إعادة الاعتبار للناس وللشعب وللجماعة ولأجل الأمة والارتباط بهذه المفاهيم الجديدة. فأتى مثلا إلى فكرة الحاكم وأنه ولي أمر، فقال لك بأنه ولي الأمر هو فرد، على حين أنه في القرآن على سبيل المثال كل المفردات المتعلقة بولي الأمر هي جماعة، ولاة الأمر أولو الأمر، فبالتالي الجماعة هو الأمر، لا يمكن أن يرتبط بالفرد الطاغية الشخص الواحد الذي يأمر الناس فيستجيبون. فأتى إلى فكرة أنه الحاكم هو وصي على الناس، إلى أنه الحاكم وكيل عن الناس، فبالتالي هو يتعامل في الفقه وفقا للوكالة، فهو لأنه الوكيل من مبادئ الفقه بأنه يعمل وفقا لرغبة الموكل، وأيضا وفقا لشروط الموكل، فأنت تعمل وفقا لشروط الشعب، وفقا لشروط الأمة، وفقا لشروط الناس، وأيضا تعمل ليس لرغبتك الشخصية ولكن لرغباته، لرغبة الناس بشكل عام، وللحفاظ على قيمهم، الحفاظ على حقوقهم، على حرياتهم، على حرماتهم، على دمائهم، على أعراضهم، إلى آخره. أتى أيضا إلى هذا الخطاب، أيضا أتى إلى مفهوم مثل مفهوم الاحتساب، وقال بأنه برغم أنه الاحتساب كلمة شاملة وعامة، إلا أنه تاريخيا من أشمل وأنبل مفاهيم الاحتساب هو الاحتساب على الفساد السياسي، الاحتساب على الفساد المالي، كما هو أيضا الاحتساب على الفساد الأخلاقي. الاحتساب على الفساد السياسي والمالي يعني الرقابة على المال العام، من السرقات، من النهب الثروات، من الظلم ونقصان العدالة في توزيع الثروة وغيرها. وتحدث عن الفساد السياسي اللي هو يتعلق بالطغيان، الانفراد بالرأي، فقدان الشورى، فقدان الارتباط بالناس وبالشعب وبالحقوق والحريات. تحدث أيضا عن مفهوم الحريات أيضا ودورها في الإسلام. تحدث عن هذا الخطاب، أيضا تحدث عن الشورى، وتحدث عن أنه دور الشورى، وكان الحامد يتحدث عن ما يسميها بحكومة الشورى، ويسمي نفسه من دعاة الشورى. الشورى التي هي عمليا المفاهيم الديمقراطية وفقا لهذا التبعية الإسلامية التي قدمها الحامد في مشروعه الثقافي والفكري. ثم أصبح مشروع حسم، يعني دعنا نقول بأنه هذا المشروع الفكري مرتبط بإعادة الاعتبار لهذه المفاهيم، وهو مشروع استئناف وليس قطيعة، مشروع لا يقول لك بأنه تماما نتقاطع مع هذه المفاهيم المحلية، ولا نتقاطع مع لا نعلن القطيعة بالأصح مع هذه المفاهيم المحلية المتاحة ثقافيا، ولا مع المفاهيم الدينية التي أتت بها كل هذه الحركات، ولكن نستأنفها بشكل حقيقي لأنه هذا الاستئناف الحضاري الذي كان في تاريخ الإسلام لم يأتي إلا عبر هذا النوع من الاستئناف، إعادة إحياء بشكل حقيقي لهذه المفاهيم بما يتوافق مع رغبة الأمة ورغبة الشعب. فهذه العمل الذي عملها الحامد نوع من اللي يصح تسميته بالاستئناف الثقافي واستئناف إسلامي للمفاهيم السياسية المتاحة. أيضا من الشغلات التي الحامد ومشروع حسم أتوا بها هو تحويل أيضا الخطاب من كونه مرتبطا بمجموعة وبحزب وبتيار إلى أفق أوسع. فتجد داخل حركة حسم الإسلامي الليبرالي تجد داخل أيضا ارتباط حسم بأنه ليس ارتباط بطائفة أو بكذا، تجد فيهم أيضا الدفاع عن حقوق الشيعة كما هو الدفاع عن حقوق السنة. خطاب وطني أراد أن يقول بأنه إصلاح حقيقي هو الرغبة بغض النظر عن الخلفيات، حتى لو نحن لدينا قناعة وعقيدة نحن أيضا فخور بها، أنه إصلاح الوطن إصلاح سياسي يتطلب نوع من هذا التحالف الشامل أو الحلف الشامل اللي لا يمكن إصلاح البلد إلا عن طريقه، وأيضا قطع الخطوط وقطع طريق على المتربصين في الداخل وفي الخارج، ومحاولة وضع الناس في بوتقة واحدة ومحاولة شيطانتهم. النقطة الأخيرة أيضا في موضوع الحامد والاستئناف وخطاب حسم، وأنا ركزت عليه لأنه هذا أيضا قد يؤثر على التطورات اللاحقة. أنه حصل جدل في داخل السعودية وفي الخارج حول هناك تيارين أساسيين. تيار يرى بأنه الإصلاح لا يتم إلا عن طريق إلغاء كل المعطيات الموجودة، إلغاء النظام القائم، وهذا أيضا فكر يعني أحيانا قد يصبح منطقيا ومعقولا، لكن الحامد في الداخل وضمن الظروف المحلية في ذلك الوقت تحدث بأنه هذا الخطاب هو خطاب اللي هو إلغاء الوضع القائم وإسقاط النظام بالكامل، هو خطاب فقط ضرورة، أنه هو أصبح يلوح فيه للنظام، يقول فيه إن إذا لم تصلحوا ولم تعملوا إصلاح حقيقي وجذري من الداخل هذا هو الواقع الذي سيحصل حتى لو لم نطالب به. فكان يلوح به بهذه الطريقة، وكان يطالب بما يسميه وما يسمى بوضوح بالملكية الدستورية، وأنه يقول ليس لدينا مع الوضع القائم ولا مع هذه الوحدة السياسية التي قامت وأصبحت بهذا الشكل، ليس لدينا خلاف مع عائلة، ليس لدينا خلاف مع مؤسسات قائمة مع جيش، نحن نريد فقط تحويل هذا وبشكل حقيقي لأجل أن يكون معبر عن رغبة الناس وفقا لانتخابات شعبية، أن يكون هناك دستور حقيقي يحمي حقوق الناس والشعب، أن يكون هناك مجلس وزراء ورئيس وزراء من الشعب هو اللي بيده كل الصلاحيات التنفيذية، ويصبح يعني حتى لو بقي الملك شكليا. كان هذا الخطاب في ذلك الوقت بمثابة محاولة لحل وحلحلة الانسداد السياسي الموجود في ذلك الوقت، وكان أيضا عمل براغماتيا محاولة التظاهر على الأقل بالانحياز لتيار داخل حتى العائلة الحاكمة ضد تيار آخر لأجل فقط محاولة تمرير هذا المشروع ومحاولة حمايته بطريقة سياسية، بغض النظر هل نجحت هذه المحاولة وأيضا قدرتنا على تقييمها ورغبتنا في تقييمها، لكن كانت هذا جزء من الخطاب أنه فيه حد معين من البراغماتية السياسية ومحاولة المناورة. أتمنى أني ما أطلت، وأعرف أني أتحدث عن أشياء قد تكون متفرقة نوعا ما، بس أني أنا عدلت كثير من النقاط التي أريد أن أطرحها وفقا للترتيب الحالي، وأيضا لأن الدكتور سعد تناول كثير من الأشياء التاريخية والنقاط متعلقة بالدين وعلاقة الدولة بالدين وغيرها، فأردت أن أتجاوزها إلى هذا المعطى الحالي. أتوقف عند هنا وشكرا لاستضافتكم.
شكرا جزيلا دكتور عبد الله. دكتور عبد الله العودة ذكر أن علاقة الدولة بالإسلام كما ذكر الدكتور سعد هي قديمة منذ بداياتها، منذ أيام محمد بن عبد الوهاب والحركة الوهابية ومحمد بن سعود. كان عبد العزيز له عدة محاولات في استعادة ما أسماه ملك آبائه، فشل مرتين ووصل إلى نتيجة أنه لا بد من استخدام العصبية أو الأيديولوجية في استعادة هذا الملك، ألا وهو التوجه نحو الإسلام والدين. واستخدم العلماء في تحقيق هذه الشرعية أو هذه العصبية، استخدم الدين في تحقيق العصبية من خلال اتهام الخصوم بالشرك والابتعاد عن الدين وقضايا الولاء والبراء، واستخدام الفكر الوهابي بارتباط المفاهيم النصية والشرعية المباشرة. والأمر الآخر طبعا كان الحكم على الآخرين من المنافسين والأضداد، سواء كان المتصوفة أو الشيعة والمختلفين معهم في التيار السني، بالهرطقة والتركيز على المفاهيم التي تدعم النظام مثل طاعة ولي الأمر. كان هناك تياران، التيار ما اسمه التيار المشرعن الذي ارتبط بالدولة وسياساتها وتوجهاتها ورغباتها، والتيار الرافض وهو تيار مرتبط بالمبدأ الوهابي، وأصبح يمثل حرجا للدولة لأنه كان يتناقض مع سياساتها في حين أنه يرفع شعارات التي ترفعها الدولة. استخدام الدين لعمل ميليشيات مسلحة أيضا كان ديدنه حتى تدافع عن النظام لتثبيته في وقت صعود الدولة السعودية الثالثة. هذا أدى في نهاية الأمر إلى صدام بين عبد العزيز آل سعود نفسه وهذه الميليشيات التي دمرها تماما. ولكن كانت هناك أيضا مدرسة وهابية تتناقض مع بعض توجهات الدولة، لأنها كانت تتعارض معها في قضايا عديدة أمثال الشيخ بن باز، ولكنهم أعطوا شرعية لأجل تحاشي، أي أن الدولة أعطتهم شرعية لأجل تحاشي وجود تيار رافض للحكم. وجدت السلطة أيضا حرجا أن بعض العلماء المحسوبين على السلطة كانوا متعاطفين مع تيار الصحوة الإسلامية، ولكن بعد غزو العراق كان هناك اعتقال لهذه الرموز، وعندما خرجت من المعتقل بعد أحداث ديسمبر كانت هناك أو حدثت هناك مراجعات مهمة، وركز عليها في حديثه في كثير من المفاهيم، وركز على 3 أمور رئيسة: العلاقة مع الآخر أي مع الغرب، الطوائف والتيارات المختلفة داخل الوطن، والموقف من المرأة ودورها الاجتماعي، والأمر الثالث كان الصراع مع فقه التشدد أمام فقه التيسير. هذه المراجعات أدت إلى خروج وتطور سياقات مهمة، هذا أدى إلى عدم احتكار الدولة للمفاهيم الدينية، خصوصا مع بروز الشيخ الحامد وحركة حسم التي طورت مفاهيم عديدة. كان هناك أيضا نتائج في هذه المراجعات في قضايا سياسية في غاية الأهمية، فمثلا أن فكرة الحاكم أنه ولي أمر أعيد تعريفها، وأن الحاكم أصبح وكيلا عند الناس يعمل وفق شروطهم أو موافقة الناس، وإعادة تعريف وظيفة الحاكم كمحافظة على حقوق ومصالح الناس. كذلك مفهوم الاحتساب ضد الفساد المالي والسياسي والأخلاقي. هذه المراجعات الفكرية كانت بمثابة تهديد للنظام، لأنها تناولت قضايا سياسية تهدد مفاهيم الاستبداد السياسي مثل الشورى والحكم ورأي الدين في دور الحاكم في المجتمع. كانت محاولة لإحياء هذه المفاهيم من خلال الاستئناف الثقافي والإسلامي للمفاهيم السياسية المتاحة. أضف إلى ذلك تحويل الخطاب من كونه مرتبط بمجموعة واحدة إلى أطياف متعددة أو متنوعة، حيث كان المشاركون مختلفين أيديولوجيا، مثل الحديث أيضا عن حقوق الشيعة والسنة والتصدر للخطاب الوطني. هذا الخطاب الحامد وخطاب حسم أحدث جدلا داخل السعودية حول مسارين. المسار الأول أن الإصلاح لا يتم إلا بإلغاء النظام القائم أو إسقاطه، والمسار الثاني هو أن خطاب الإصلاح يمكن أن يتم من خلال التغيير الذاتي في الدولة تجاه إحداث ملكية دستورية على سبيل المثال، وأن إن لم يتم ذلك فذلك سيتيح للمسار الأول المطالبة بانتخابات شعبية، دستور حقيقي، رئيس وزراء بيده صلاحيات عديدة. كان هذا أيضا جزء من المسار الذي اتبعه هذا الخط، وأن انحاز في وقت من الأوقات إلى تيار داخل الدولة لمحاولة تمرير هذا المشروع، وهذا يثبت وجود شيء من البراغماتية السياسية. وهذا طبعا يأخذنا إلى المسار الحالي، وهو ما تحدث عنه الدكتور سعد قبل ذلك. الآن ننتقل إلى المداخلة الثالثة للدكتور سعيد بن ناصر، فليتفضل مشكورا.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. أولا شكر لمنظمي هذا المؤتمر عن تجارب الحركات الإسلامية في السياسة والحكم، وشكر موصول لجامعة صباح الدين زعيم وللدكتور عصام ولجميع الزملاء، وشكر أيضا لمن تقدمني بالحديث وهم أفضل مني وأعلم، الدكتور سعد الفقيه ذو اليد الطولى في هذه القضايا، والتي والذي عاد الناس إلى رأيه بعد مرور سنوات طويلة من اختياره المنفى يعني استشعاره من مدة طويلة أن البلد يتجه إلى هذا الاتجاه. موضوعي هو عن الحركة الإسلامية في السعودية، الدروس المستفادة وآفاق المستقبل. وبطبيعة الحال أن من سبقني دكاترة الفضلاء الدكتور سعد والدكتور عبد الله تحدثوا عن مجموعة من القضايا التي كنت قد دونتها هنا، ولكني سأتجاوزها أو أمر عليها مرورا عاجلا. المعروف، أو دعوني أقول لكم بأنني قسمت الموضوع إلى عدة محاور. المقصود بالحركة الإسلامية، ووصف مجمل للحركات الإسلامية بمعناها المجازي أو بمعناها العام، ثم الدروس المستفادة، ثم آفاق المستقبل. أما المقصود بالحركة الإسلامية في طرحي هذا فهو لا يختص بالحركات الإسلامية التجمعات التنظيمية التي تقوم بعمل إسلامي وفق نظام ومنهج وقيادة وجنود، لكن نتكلم عن معنى أعم. فالمملكة منذ استقرار الحكم عبد العزيز بعد قضائها على حركة إخوان من طاع الله، والذين استعملهم طبعا في القضاء على مناوئيه وخضد بهم شوكة القبائل، منع هو وجميع الملوك الذين جاءوا من بعده وجود أي حركة إسلامية منظمة، خاصة تلك المرتبطة بالإخوان المسلمين. لكن المدارس والجامعات والمناهج التعليمية كان فيها يعني امتد إليها الفكر الإسلامي الحديث من القارة الهندية حتى العراق والشام ومصر وشمال إفريقيا. وبطبيعة الحال مع أحداث نزوح الإخوان إلى السعودية وإيواء الملك فيصل لهم مغايظة لعبد الناصر، المهم أن هذا الفكر انتشر وشاع واستفاد منه النابهون لما فيه من إجابات متعلقة بالواقع ورسم لخطط المستقبل وإيجاد بدائل مصرفية وغيرها، وأيضا لما فيه من قدرة على التعامل مع الأمور الواقعية بلا غبش، والتعامل مع الانحرافات والتلبيسات التي تستخدمها الدولة. طبيعة نشأة الدولة التي ذكرها الدكاترة قبلي، يعني بيعة محمد بن سعود للشيخ محمد بن عبد الوهاب على النصرة والمؤازرة. بالمناسبة أقول أن محمد بن سعود هو الذي بايع محمد بن عبد الوهاب على النصرة والمؤازرة، وليس العكس كما يقول محمد بن سلمان الآن. كان هذا هو السبب الحقيقي يعني خروج محمد بن سعود من إطار قريته وعشيرته التي كان شيخا قبليا فيها أو عليها، وكان يعني حدود دولته أو حدود مشيخته لا تتجاوز حدود هذه القرية في أحدى معاطف وادي حنيفة. لكن هذه النشأة الدينية الوهابية جعلت مشروعية الدولة تقوم على أسس دينية، سواء ذلك على وجه الحقيقة كما في أول النشأة، أو بعض الحقيقة كما في وسط النشأة، أو على وجه الدعاية كما في الوسط المتأخر، أو على وجه الرفض كما هو الآن. هذه السمة للدولة جعلت العمل الإسلامي يتراوح بين قطبي دعم الدولة ومساندتها وموافقتها، بحيث بقي مجال الحركة الإسلامية يدور في هذا المجال لمنفعة الدولة من جهة ومنفعة العاملين الإسلام من جهة أخرى، على تفاوت بين حجم المنفعتين.
Relation to the state by mutual interest. Based on that, the Islamic movement in Saudi Arabia can be described figuratively, so to speak, or to include all the main actors of the Islamic action in the country, including the formal powers as well as informal powers or public powers. The formal include the scholars, institutions like the Islamic World Association, the Ministry of Hajj, the Ministry of Religious Affairs and Endowments, or charities, as well as the Jami school of thought, who have become known as such. This was directly, completely or partially related or linked to the regime, which tried to make an organic relation with this side, either directly with the ministries or indirectly. And that's, of course, the characteristic of all hereditary regimes and central regimes that depend on the autocracy, a security state where the governor or the ruler would be the patron rather than the um, helper or supporter. As for the informal, some of those were related to the state more or and some were less related, including, for example, the Islamic World Association, which was sort of linked to the state, although it had its own in-laws, which gave it a margin of independence. But all the norms and all the independence were cancelled or all of this was annulled, rendering it into another tool in the hands of the regime. The same applies also to the Jami school of thought, which was a Salafi group but was controlled by the security forces, so much so that it was uh, controlled by them, that they actually went even further than they went even requested by the authorities. As for the other groups, some of them were completely affiliated with the school, with the university, the state, and others were less associated with the state. But those institutions were totally or almost completely overtaken, and many of the charities have been suspended and their accounts have been frozen. This is in terms of the formal powers. As for the informal, I mean the Dawah schools and the scientific, academic, and educational institutions, which I believe are include the Wahhabi Salafism, particularly those who remained clinging to the principles, the Muslim Brotherhood and Tabligh. The Salafi Wahhabi, before the new king or crown prince came along, they had the upper hand and they have their most influence in the curricula of the Sharia faculty, and even they affect the publications that are beyond its own scope, and it is rather fierce with disagreements or disagreeing opinions, particularly. However, they were lenient with the ruler, and this was a general trait of the Salafis, Wahhabis, even those who are independent. As for the independent Salafism, they were similar to the Muslim Brotherhood schools, but they are critical of the Muslim Brotherhood, and so this school was busy for a long time in criticizing and the Muslim Brotherhood and trying to exclude it, although after 2017 this became less of a priority. And also it is distinguished for the Muslim Brotherhood is distinguished for its political and social understanding, and that's why it's regarded as a rival for the authorities. And the Muslim Brotherhood include many of the scholars who were brought up on the writings of the Muslim Brotherhood and publications, and although they were not formal members of the Muslim Brotherhood, these schools are mostly regional or supranational in nature, and they use the Salafi approach in terms of the doctrine, and they have external arms outside, and they work on alternative Islamic issues like student unions, banking systems, etc. But they remained under the supervision of the state, and they mostly used a reformist discourse and refused any other approach. And along with Salafism, they went along with the status quo, although they contributed to the paper that was meant, or the memo that was mentioned by my colleague, the advice memo, etc. As for the Tabligh group, they are as old as the state itself, and it came from India and had its followers from inside Saudi Arabia, and it continued on its approach, and it was cracked down upon by the state, and there was a formal effort to make people refrain from joining the ranks of a Tabligh, and some people who were sentenced to death and who had done terrorist attacks were asked or forced to say that they were affected by the Tabligh ideology in order to demonize this group. And at the end of the day, Salman issued or categorized them as terrorists along with the Muslim Brotherhood. As for the lessons learned, first of all, there is the illusion of the complete peace and ability to appease with the rulers. People are starting to be disillusioned with this and started to be aware of this. So this illusion of complete puritanism of doctrine and faith has become left away by the new awareness. And also the second lesson learned is not to exert too much effort into the details, or because those partial issues and detailed issues, although they enriched the discussions, but they distracted the scholars from the important questions for the Ummah. Another lesson learned from the past period of time is, let's say, that there was a lethal conflict that would kill the efforts, the coordination, or any effort. This conflict should become part of the past, so that people would cooperate in order to achieve the interest of their country and their people. Over the past period, there was a next to total dependency on the state and tendency to believe it. Even those who were politically aware, they would believe it, or at least pretend to do so. But now this has become not an option. Actually, it has become something that we have to do without, because it caused so many perils for many. And another issue that we have to learn from the past, which is the importance of a general public awareness, political awareness. Or there was an avoidance in political awareness of civil society, human rights, etc. This avoidance made people go into a sort of a coma in terms of political affairs, issues related to rights, awareness of their own rights, and people have come to believe that they're just a group of incompetent people who have a guardian who is the state and who knows better what is good for them. They would give this person a restriction, that person a sword, that person an award, in order to discipline these people, which in their view are a group of incompetent people who need this kind of guardianship. This awareness in rights and political affairs have made people reach a point where uh, they shut doubt on the effectiveness of Islamic movements and their point. Although there were some efforts previously, like Dr. Saad mentioned, such as the association of the Legitimate Rights Association, which had a political action, such as the advice memo, which was about 40 pages long, and also other advice memos and visits to the princes and meetings. But this did not give fruit in terms of public rights and political awareness. Another question was the spiritual desertification, so to speak. So the conflict between the existing schools or groups and the attempt to appease the state and to be distracted with the details co- caused as spiritual desertification away from a sense of sacrifice and in sympathy. And also one of the things that what had an influence was the impact of luxury. There was affluence, although it was earned or it was deserved or worthy for those people, but it gave rise to a sense of selfishness. So people would say, if I have my own house, if I have my own car, my children are at universities, why would I look for anything else? And another issue from the lessons learned is to stand up to the public uh, or to the breaches by the public while disregarding those by the state. And this caused a lot of unrest among the people, and also working from abroad in fear of the state. Let me give you this as a joke. We are this incident anecdote actually. We were in Jeddah in with a group of scholars and an elite from the community. And they were all categorized in a way. This is from the Muslim Brotherhood. This is from Syria. This is from Salafis. This is it's or Sururi and etc. And I told them, you have been classified as such by the state. Why don't you then declare or start an association in your names publicly together? And their eyes almost came out uh, for, because they were too frightened. And I was questioned about this by the security forces later. I told them, I said this because you are pushing people to do this, because you are categorizing me. And when you brand me as such, I will not be able to disown that brand. Even if you say that I don't agree with the Muslim Brotherhood, even if you say that I don't belong to the Sururis, etc., this brand would not go away. Another anecdote, actually, one of the people from the university, professors, who was very recently, over the past few weeks, questioned by or interrogated by the security forces. He was questioned on why he mentioned Saad al-Faqih. Of course, Saad al-Faqih is known for them, and their question was legitimate. But why did you mention A'ad al-Qarni as well? Al-Qarni actually declared that his religion was the religion of Muhammad bin Salman, that his sahwa was the sahwa of Muhammad bin Salman. Nonetheless, he and his followers are accused and branded. Another lesson is this, which is a good aspect, which is religious education and providing a conducive environment for religiously, although there has been some deliberate undermining of this atmosphere. The final point in terms of the future outlook or prospects, and this is my personal view, I believe there is going to be weakening or of the impact of some of the formal institutions such as the Islamic union or the scholars under the state. They will have less of an influence, and then I understand, I believe we should correct the mistakes and overcome the obstacles, and I believe it is the independent Salafis, the Saruris, and the Muslim Brotherhoods are most equipped for that mission, and I believe that there is a desire among a large number of those concerned with the public situation in the country, whether from those schools or others, to communicate with opposition outside or abroad, to know their opinions and to learn about their views. And I have personal knowledge of a number of people who would usually warn you against communicating with those people abroad, such as Dr. Saad al-Faqih, but they are now addicted to listening to them, and this is an advance in the influence of those people. Also, I believe there would be some more mature and braver Islamic powers who will speak out against corruption and normalization, and this can be used for the benefit of all. And also, despite the security blows, the Islamists would be able to guarantee the unification of the territory of the state, and in case of a fall of a regime. And also another prospect would be that the regime would go to extremes in damaging not only its relation to its own people, but also to its neighbors, and starting animosities with others, particularly with its involvement in Yemen and its animosity with Iran. All of those are going to affect a lot and feed into the making of a new generation of influential people, or the awakening of a number of Islamic powers, which you may have used to think that reform from within the state would be possible. And also another prospect would be the new conviction that the only way is change, because there is no prospect for reform. So the Islamic movement have to get ready for all the coming stages, the fall of the regime, the transition, the maintaining security, and then introducing a parliament and a constitution, as well as other issues that are necessary for a genuine state rather than a corrupt state. I believe I have surpassed my time limit. I apologize for that. Thank you for listening. Thank you so much, Dr. Saeed bin Nasser al-Ghamidi. The Dr. Saeed described what he called the Islamic movement, and saying that it doesn't necessarily, or it's not just restricted to organized groups or movements. In Saudi Arabia, from the very beginning, the state was religious, so any organized Islamic movement could fall under that definition. and we had the Muslim, the Islamic movement affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, particularly with the exile of some Muslim Brotherhood leaders from other countries, and he went back to the agreement between Muhammad bin Saud and Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, saying that the pledge was, and the bay'ah was from Muhammad bin Saud to Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, not the other way around. But the deal was in a way that it would be mutually reinforcing. So all Islamic movements fell under that definition, and then he spoke about formal and informal forces, including the scholars and the universities or formal institutions, the charities, as well as the Madkhali and Jami schools of thought. And he said that some institutions were more or closer to the state than others, and some of them have even become part of the security apparatus, particularly the Jami school of thought. Some the charities have varying degrees of closeness to the state, and some were confiscated and their accounts suspended. As for the independence, he referred to the Dawah schools, some of which represent the Wahhabi Salafism, which is quite fierce with those who disagree and lenient with the ruler, and a modern Salafism or independent Salafism, which is affected by modern age, but is known for its criticism of the Muslim Brotherhood. And there is also the Muslim Brotherhood school, where we have many scholars who were affected by the Muslim Brotherhood, not necessarily members thereof, and they are mostly regional or cross-national charity, and they're politically active. And this school remained under the state and used a reformist approach. And there is also a Tabligh movement, which is as old as the state, with the pilgrims from India, but there was a lot of crackdown on it and defamation. As for lessons learned, he mentioned a number of lessons learned. First of all, purity in doctrine and daring fatwas have taken a step back. And another issue was the raising awareness that we should not be distracted with the details away from the major questions. Another issue was the fatal conflict that makes the internal conflict that plays into the interest of the regime. The fourth lesson was that there was a tendency to believe the state and its narrative, but now this has become rejected. The fifth was that there was an avoidance in political awareness and disseminating awareness among the masses, but this has changed now, and people are starting to understand that the rulers are not guardians of their own fate. And another the sixth lesson was about the awakening, which or the sahwa, which is important after the luxurious life that affected people's sympathy and involvement. Seventh was the crackdown on breaches by the people and being lenient with breaches by the rulers. Finally, that disseminating religious and Islamic knowledge was important no matter what the state says about it. The final thing is he said was that the obstacles and problems have to be addressed, and the strengths have to be used particularly by the followers of the independent Salafism as well as Muslim Brotherhood, and that they should pay enough attention to communicating with elites outside Saudi Arabia and within, and also to prepare themselves in case of an internal fissure or crack, and that this phase in the confrontation between the state and the Islamic movement is giving rise to a new generation that no longer believes in the possibility of reform, but that change is the only way, because this requires awareness, preparedness, and programs in order to maintain the unity of the state, call for parliaments, and a genuine practice of statehood. Thank you so much, Dr. Saeed. Now we move to our commentators. The first commentator is Dr. Isam Abdeshafi. Please go ahead.
آسف والله أنا آسف جدا.
You mentioned that Dr. Yassin would go first, right? Oh, I'm really sorry, Dr. Yassin. And we're usually finished with lessons learned, but today we also wanted to tackle the external dimension.
لا ما ننساك، مستحيل ننساك سيدي.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أستاذ سعد.
Peace be upon you. Thank you, Dr. Said Al-Faqih, Nasser Al-Ghamidi, Abdullah Al-Auda, and
أشكركم على هذا النقاش. جدا أنا استفدت كثير
thank you for this discussion, and I have what I wanted to speak about. I have heard from the former speakers, and I don't have anything left to speak about. That's why I said that that's fine if I don't speak. I wasn't joking, but since I have this opportunity, so of course I will have my input. I was planning to say some stuff, but I found that everything I wanted to speak about were mentioned, and of course all the speakers before me are well aware of what they are speaking about. And the title of my paper is Looking from Outside at the Islamic Movements in Saudi Arabia, and I'm from outside. But what outside? Outside of whom? We are as Ummah, we are one Ummah, so we are outside Saudi Arabia, but we are not outside the Ummah. We are part of the Ummah. But I believe that after listening to all of the speeches, I found that there might be a different perspective from Turkey and towards the Saudi Arabia and the policy of Saudi Arabia. The Islamic movements in Saudi Arabia are different from other Islamic movements in the world, especially that the Muslim Brotherhood is present in most of the Arab or the Muslim countries, and it is a movement that represents the backbone of the Islamic movement in the world. But in Turkey, we don't have the organization of the Muslim Brotherhood, but we have the Mirigush, which is the national one that we have. And the nature of the relation between Najmuddin Erbakan with Saudi Arabia was different from what we have seen. What we have in the Saudi Arabia now. In the days of Erbakan, he had good relations with Saudi Arabia.
العلاقات السعودية أيضا كانت طيبة مع نجمة أربكان وحركة الإسلامية في تركيا. لأنها كانت تؤيد الحركات الإسلامية، وحتى كانت تدعم بعض الدراسات الإسلامية في تركيا. وكنا
So
نرى
some of the studies in Turkey, it shows that Erbakan every year would make use of the Hajj or the pilgrimage journey to send some messages or make some meetings.
يوجهوا الرحلات للحج من الحركة، وكانوا يجتمعوا
So there were pilgrimage journeys by members from the movement, and it was a kind of a training, education of the Islamic movement, and for the
للتنظيمات لبعض التنظيمات في تركيا. وكل سنة وكان كان نجم الدين أربكان أيضا ينتقد بهذا السبب.
نجم الدين Erbakan was also criticized because of that, because at the days the extremist secularism was prevailing in Turkey, and there was a decline in all of the Islamic slogans and Islamic terminology. He was under that pressure. Nevertheless, he was doing that in Saudi Arabia, and that pressure made the Islamic movement in Turkey part of this tension, and they were fed by this tension as well.
السعودية والحركة كانوا السعودية والحركات الإسلامية في تركيا كانوا
Saudi Arabia and the Islamic movement in
وهذا طبعا
Turkey, they were on the same side, and that was different from from other countries. For example, in Algeria in 1992, when the Islamic movement won under the Salvation Party.
وجبهة الإسلامية لعباس مدني
or Abbas Madani with the Islamic Front. The kingdom was supporting this the coup against this movement because they felt that it was a threatening to the kingdom in Saudi Arabia. We should also remember the history with the relations that were there between the Sheikh family and the Saud family, and the allegiance that was made between the two families, as Dr. Saad mentioned. This is a well-known history that is not forgotten. What we also need to not to forget that the establishment of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia came after the fragmentation of the Ottoman Caliphate, because which represented an umbrella for the Ummah and the Islam. Because after abolishing the Caliphate, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was established, as well as other countries like Jordan, Iraq. So the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia had a role in that. So the founding of the kingdom was indebted for this fragmentation and the foreign occupation of the territories of the Ottoman lands. This condition, the international condition,
احتضنت وحتى امتلكت التمثيل
that Saudi Arabia was controlling the political Islam in the world. And I'm not meaning that in the sense that is used today. So it became the center of Islam because of the two holy mosques, and for Turkey, it seemed that there was no problem in the practices of secularism in Turkey, because Turkey is Turkey and it's secular and it doesn't have the right to represent Islam. And now it is back to its normal condition, and this condition was supported. However, the relation of Arbakan with the kingdom was good.
من حسن ظنه أنا أعتقد، لأن الوضع والرؤية إلى أربكان ما كانت كما هو كان يظن. أنا أعتقد
Although the way the kingdom was looking at Arbakan wasn't as he wanted. So on the 28th of February, during the coup against Arbakan, the visit to Saudi Arabia was one of the excuses for the coup against Arbakan during that day. And the association or the International Union for of the Muslim world supported some of the religious or religious services or Islamic services in Turkey. And when that was revealed, it was used as one of the reasons that the secular people were criticizing Kanaan Nuran more than criticizing him that he was behind the coup. So the coup was better than receiving some support from the association of the Muslim world. So when it was revealed under the pressure of the secular people, he came and defended himself that that support was so little, and it was only to support the religious groups, and Turkey was weak and poor and couldn't support such activities. So that was so there was a lot of criticism there. The relations or the Turkish relations
في تكوين حركة الإسلامية في تركيا كان له هذا الدور العجيب طبعا عندما
or the Saudi role in the establishment of the Islamic movement in Turkey had that that strange role. But we should not forget that the foreign Saudi policy, when we speak about it, we need to differentiate between King Faisal and his policies. Saudi Arabia accommodated the Islamic movements that were serving it or serving the policy of Saudi Arabia according to the international environment. So, for example, when Hassan al-Banna visited Saudi Arabia in 1946 and he visited King Abdulaziz bin Saud, he was welcomed. But when he asked Saudi Arabia to open an office for him, it was rejected for trivial reasons, and they were well known. The first one was because of the position of the Muslim Brotherhood of occupation in the world, and the Muslim Brotherhood used to represent the global Islam after the fall of Caliphate. After the group or the Jama'ah of India, because these two organizations were the insurance of representing Muslims after the fall of the Caliphate. So it was an attempt for that, and there was effort in that regard, and it was and of course one of the objectives of the UK and of France from the toppling of the caliphate was to eliminate the unity of the Muslims. So Saudi Arabia, although they welcomed al-Banna when he asked to open an office for the Muslim Brotherhood in Saudi Arabia, they were afraid. I mean, Saudi Arabia was afraid of the Muslim Brotherhood, or to provide because they had experience in the social organization, and they felt that it is a threat against the kingdom.
وكل هذا وطبعا هذا لا شك الملك فيصل وسياسته كانت
King
تختلف عن
Faisal and his policy was different from other members of the family.
عن إخلاصه
Nobody can speak or judge his honesty or nobility in
لما
dealing with the
جاءت
causes of the Islamic Ummah.
الاحتلال أو انتهاك القدس وحاول وعمل المبادرة للتشكيل المنظمة التعاون
After
الإسلامي.
occupation of Al-Quds, he tried to take the initiative to unify the countries in the conference of the Muslim Ummah. This was the main strong step to establish an international Muslim organization after uh, destroying the caliphate.
ولهذا رأينا تقارب كبير بين الحركة الإسلامية وبين حركة بين
That's why we find rapprochement between the Islamic movement and Saudi Arabia at the time, and at the time the Nasrists wanted to have
هذا كان بديل للوحدة العرب كوحدة الإسلام وهذا كان
the place for the unity of Arabs, and that was put vis-a-vis the unity of Muslims.
الإسلام تركيا أيضا أصبحت جزء منها وهذا كان شيء
Turkey has become part of that as well, and as we see at the end
أفغانستان الذي أشار به الإخوة السابقين الذي جمعت كل القوات وأرسلتهم إلى دعمتهم في الحرب الجهادي في السعودية. هذا كانت تستخدم الإسلام والحركات الإسلامية وكانت هذه أيضا وفقا للسياسات الأمريكية لا شك منها. هذه ما كانت من
of course that was followed that was influenced by the US policy and the use of the soft power. Of course, Saudi Arabia was it is the land of the two holy mosques, and the flag holds the slogan of the worshipping one God. So they wanted to be on top of all of the Islamic movements, and the United States and the UK sent their forces to support the Al-Qaeda forces in Afghanistan, but at the same time there was the Iranian Revolution started, and it was claiming that it represents the Islamic movement in the world. That put some kind of competition between Saudi Arabia and Iran and who will serve the Islamic movement. But this competition made Saudi Arabia use and employ some Islamic movements against Iran. That didn't serve Islam. They were serving their own policy. Each country was serving its own policy, actually. And that was under or in line with the policy of the United States. Finally, we reached the period of the Arab Spring, and even the Arab Spring
لا شك المملكة السعودية شعرت لها تهديد.
In the time of the Arab Spring, Saudi Arabia felt that there is a threat, or that this spring will be threatening to Saudi Arabia, and all of the cause of the democracy will come with waves that will hit Saudi Arabia and the other monarchies. So it has taken a very sharp stance against it. Or Saudi Arabia can, for example,
ولا تؤدد السعودية
although
لأن
these waves didn't threaten Saudi Arabia and didn't get into Saudi Arabia because each one was working in its own sphere. For example, Egypt, Libya, and Yemen, they are completely different from the conditions in Saudi Arabia or in Jordan.
تواجهت هذا الربيع، هذه موجة الربيع بطريقة
Even in Jordan, this spring moved there in a smart way. But the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has taken a strong attitude against this Arab Spring, and it has taken this radical tendency or position against the Islamic movements. And we have seen that in Egypt, for example, it used its influence against the moderate Muslim Islamic movements. So although they have the slogan, or they raised the slogan of Islam, moderate Islam, now they supported the Hizb the Noor party, which is a Salafi party, or another party. Those movements were more extreme in their interpretation of Islam, but and they imprisoned all the scholars who were seen as a threat against Saudi Arabia. But in what sense? For example, someone like Salman al-Auda, he is one who is one of the most moderate Muslim scholars in his interpretation and his works. And at the time where the Salafists were criticizing women who are driving cars, Salman al-Auda was calling for allowing women to drive and saying that women used to ride camels during the day of the Prophet. And when they were calling for the jihad in Afghanistan, Salman al-Auda was criticizing that, and he said jihad should be in your own country, and Afghanistan doesn't need the Gulf fighters or the Saudi fighters. And jihad is to raising awareness about Islam. So I believe that Salman al-Auda and people like him who are in prison now are the ones who can make Islam appealing for the young people. I used to say that when Salman al-Auda came to Istanbul, for example, how the young people were coming to salute him and to say hi to him. He was the only one who was using social media in an early stage. So he was one of the early people who used social media for the da'wah, and now he is in prison. And we have seen how Muhammad bin Salman, who raised the slogan of moderate Islam,
لأن هذا للأسف كان له زبون. هذا الكلمة الإسلام المعتدل هو كان يشعر في العالم الإسلام في
this word, the moderate Islam, was something that he prepared because they were it sells very well, and there were clients who wanted to capture that from him in this world. So the West are
للإسلام.
not clients for moderate Islam, but rather they are clients of extremist Islam because this boosts their vision, or their Orientalist vision of Islam, that Islam is a religion of terror, and that Islam is extreme by nature, and that's how they depict Islam.
هو عدو للحركات الإسلامية الديمقراطية. الحقيقة العدوان على على أو الشيطنة الإخوان أو شيطنة
Demonizing Muslim Brotherhood or the Islamic movement represent the fear of democracy. The Islamophobia that we see today in all of the world is feeding on or fed by some Arab countries like Egypt or Saudi Arabia or UAE, and they are inciting the West against Islam. And we only see the Islamophobia from the West according to these campaigns. Now, we are uh, reaping the results or the fruits of that work. Muhammad Morsi in the beginning,
في هذا أو إخلاص
if you look at the Turkish policy in this field, he wanted to make the first visit to Turkey, and Abdullah Gül, who was the president of the Turkish Republic, he was from the AK party, and Ahmad Davutoglu as well. They asked him first, or advised him first, to visit Saudi Arabia and not to come to Turkey. If Mohammed Morsi, even if there is honor of this visit, we want to leave that honor for Saudi Arabia because we don't want to be seen as competitors with Saudi Arabia, or rather, we want to create something new, a new Islamic world where all the parties respect each other and we are all for the service of Islam. So they advised him to make his first visit to Saudi Arabia, not to Turkey, to be a kind of gift for Saudi Arabia.
ولكن ما رأينا بعد ذلك للأسف رغم أن
However,
تابع هذه النصيحة. طيب
although Mohammed Morsi, may he rest in peace, he followed this advice, Saudi Arabia and UAE supported the coup against him. And I want to mention something, another thing. Najmuddin Arbakan, who wanted to build the same thing, a new Islamic world with the same respect, where parties therein respect each other. He wanted to
وطبعا من محور من أهم
establish the D8 project, and the most important countries in this D8 was Saudi Arabia, and he visited Saudi Arabia for that purpose. And when the AK party came to power and the President Erdogan of Turkey tried to implement that project again, adding more countries to this project.
من بعد الربيع العربي للأسف.
There is one final point. After the Arab Spring, unfortunately, is what we have seen from Saudi Arabia was only the continuation of a policy that is more secular policy. Although Turkey is officially a secular country, but it is trying to follow the interests of the entire Ummah. And Saudi Arabia, although it's not a secular country, it is more secular in its movement, in its policies. Of course, this will be harmful to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia still has the opportunity to use Islam as a soft power, but for the interest of Islam as well.
ومن أجل مصلحة الإسلام، وهذا ابتعادها من الإسلام واتباعها للسياسات
Stepping away from Islam and following a secular policy outside, it will be detrimental for Saudi Arabia. And as we see in Yemen, for example, if they accept to have
نجاح حزب الإصلاح لو لا يكون لها هذا
for example, the governance of the Al-Islah movement
هناك
or
سهل
party,
في يمن، ولكن
I believe the solution in Yemen will be easy. But
الاهتمام بالحركة الإصلاح لا تريد أن يفتح أمام الحركة الإصلاح، وهذا يوديها إلى امتداد الحركة.
they don't want to show interest in Al-Islah party
الحوثية بمستوى المطلوب، وهذا في نهاية المطاف يضر المستقبل السعودية.
and they want this conflict to continue with the Houthi movement, but that will be detrimental for Saudi Arabia at the end of the day. But I hope that they will go back to the to the wisdom and to get back to the normal, which will be most important for the Muslim Ummah. Thank you very much, Dr. Yassin. Yassin Attai is giving a vision or a prospect from outside from Saudi Arabia, and he says that
ولكن في تركيا ليس
in Turkey there is no Muslim Brotherhood per se, but there was a movement by Najmuddin Erbakan, and his relation with Saudi Arabia was strong and good. Saudi Arabia was supporting the Islamic movement in Turkey, and Erbakan was using the journey of pilgrimage for training, ordination, and learning, and he was criticized in Turkey because of the relation with Saudi Arabia, especially at the time where secularism was dominating in Turkey. So he was criticized by the secular and people, and he was supporting the Islamic movement to be more distinguished in Turkey. And he was accused that the movement became in one entrench with Saudi Arabia, and even in the elections in Algeria in the 90s, it showed that Saudi Arabia was against the Islamic groups in Algeria. And then he spoke about the demolition of the caliphate and how some attempts were seen as a revival of caliphates, and for a long time Saudi Arabia was representing in the conscience of the Muslims, especially after the decline of the Turkish role in representing Muslims, and with this relation between Erbakan and Saudi Arabia. However, this relation was used as a justification or an excuse for the coup against Erbakan in the 90s. So, in short, the role of Saudi Arabia in Turkey was very important. The foreign policy of Turkey accommodated some of the Islamic movements under the days of Faisal,
استعماري لبريطانيا وأمريكا في تصفية
especially with in light of the role of the occupying powers like France and the UK in the demolition of the caliphate. And Dr. King Faisal had an attempt to create an Islamic association, and the movement or the tendency in the Arab world was to create an Islamic movement or an Islamic association, and that was welcomed in Turkey, and even supporting the Afghanistan, even if it was seen by the or with the according to some of the policies, even by the United States. So there was an attempt to create or there was a competition, especially with the presence of the Iranian revolution that presented itself as a competitor of the or representative of Islam. With the coming of the Arab Spring, Saudi Arabia has seen that the Arab Spring is a threat for the regime because it's calling for democracy and the societal change, which is seen by the officials in Saudi Arabia that it will affect the monarchy in Saudi Arabia. Although Turkey told the Saudi Arabia that the Arab Spring doesn't affect your regime, and Saudi Arabia used all of its power to fight the Arab Spring in order to not to have it have any waves of the Arab Spring reach the shores of Saudi Arabia. After the incidents of Arab Spring, Saudi Arabia was afraid that it will extend. So some of the scholars who were with the Arab Spring, they demonized them, and because of that, fear of Saudi Arabia was not justified, because the first visit of Morsi came to Saudi Arabia, and that was under the advice of Erdogan, who told him to visit Saudi Arabia in his first visit. And the project of Erbakan was to have an institution, a big institution that represents Islam, which is called the D8, including Saudi Arabia as one of the most important countries in that project. But there was no good response for that. After the Arab Spring, or after the defeat or the failure of the Arab Spring, Saudi Arabia became more secular in its foreign policy, and it's not interested about the interests of Islam or serving Islam, and its foreign policy became detrimental. Saudi Arabia can use Islam by supporting the causes of Islam, but it chose to be or to combat the Muslims, as we see in Yemen, for example. They were against Al-Islah Party, and similar attitudes were taken in other areas. Thank you very much, Dr. Yassin. Now we will move to the comments, and I will start with Dr. Isam Abdel Shafi. The floor is yours.
In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, peace be upon you all. I would like to thank the University of Sabahattin Zaim and the SIGA Center and Dr. Sami Al-Aryan for this initiative and this magnificent undertaking, which has been going on for about 6 months. And this is the 5th symposium. And I would like to thank all of the speakers, Dr. Saad Al-Faqih, Dr. Yassin Aqtai, Dr. Abdullah Al-Auda, Dr. Amjad Jibril.
الأمر كثيرا بس في ملاحظة
and Dr. Saeed bin Nasser. I realized only 5 minutes ago that the Arabic YouTube link has no voice.
وهناك كثير من التعليقات طالبت بالصوت
There are so many comments that
لحظة واحدة. تيمور, are you there? تيمور, can you hear me?
أظن خيار أن يعني ميوت Arabic original audio غلط.
لحظة.
أو نتحول إلى لغة الإشارة.
لا لحظة.
هي اللغة الإنجليزية تعمل ولكن اللغة العربية.
تيمور, can you hear me?
Yes. أنا أفهم من ميوت.
Okay, I am told that the Arabic channel is not working. That people are complaining that the Arabic channel was not working. Is not working. Is that true?
No, it's working now.
Okay, I'm not talking about now. I'm talking about throughout this. Has it?
Yeah, there was a glitch for I think 1 minute. It happened before, but now it's working.
Okay. Do you have everything recorded?
Yeah. It's recording on Zoom also.
Thank you. طيب هو يقول أنها فقط كانت لدقائق.
I've been told that this glitch lasted for a couple of minutes, but anyway, this session have been recorded and it would be uploaded on our YouTube channel. So if there has been anything that was missed in the live broadcast or live streaming, you will be able to catch up with it. I would like to salute all the speakers for the distinguished papers, and what I would say is not really a comment, because you have great standing in what you have provided, but only I have a few remarks which may complement the different aspects of the scene. When we talk about the religious aspect of politics in Saudi Arabia, it is very important but also controversial. One of the problematic issues about it is the dimension of legitimacy, given that the regime in Saudi Arabia used the religion as one of the most important sources of legitimacy, not only vis-a-vis the people inside, but also many of the regional and international powers. And the other issue is the difference between the religious aspect and the implementation of Islamic Sharia. In other words, was the Saudi Arabian, but was the Saudi regime which held the banner of Islam actually implementing Sharia in its politics, its security, social and political affairs, or was there a discrepancy there? The third issue was the dialectic of the religious aspect and the positioning of scholars. In my point of view, the regime was not dealing with the scholars as a source of advice or a source of awakening for the society, but as a function of its own in order to be utilized for its own ends. On the other side of the coin, I would like to focus on what Dr. Yassin Aqtai mentioned, which is utilizing the religious character of Saudi Arabia. I mean, the use of that aspect by international powers, particularly the United States, to use Saudi Arabia as a carrier or for many of its projects as a religious leader. As you know, there were in the 60s and 70s, they had many scholars whom they attracted to by direction from the United States, actually, to overcome the Nasri and nationalist rise. And then also we had 1979 with the Iranian Islamic Revolution, when we have the cock crow with saying that there are two different civilizational models and the other model has to be obliterated, because the rise of this Iranian model may mean the demise of the Saudi model. Also, there is the Afghan war, where the religious component was used par excellence by the regime, and it was further used in Lebanon when we were told that the Saudi Arabia was the defendant of the Sunnis in Lebanon in the face of Iran, which was supporting the Shia in Lebanon, rendering Lebanon as an area of conflict between two regional powers supported by international powers. And also after 2003, with the invasion of Iraq, Saudi Arabia was utilized by the US in order to say that they stand up for the Sunni rights in Iraq vis-a-vis the Iranian support of the Shia component in Iraq. And in 2005, Saudi Arabia was told, we were told that there were some statements by Saudi Arabia, if you remember, those were then withdrawn by an advisor from the king, that they are going to support the Sunnis and even some armed militias against Iran in Iraq. The other dimension I wanted to shed light upon in relation to Saudi policy towards Islamic movements, we had two models. The first was utilization, i.e. the regime in Saudi Arabia utilized some political movements with Islamic background to serve its own end when they had certain ends in specific files, such as their endeavors in Yemen. So when they were crushing al-Islah, but then they started to use it as a card. The same applies to the Muslim Brotherhood and their model in Egypt. They were utilized in the 50s and 60s, but then after the Arab Spring, they were cracked down upon. The issue I wanted to point out was that the regime in Saudi Arabia has no strategic outlook, because Islamic or a political movement with an Islamic background may constitute some of the most important pillars of this regime's constituency, and the regime can depend on them if they manage their relations with them well. I'm not talking about utilization, because utilization is not acceptable, but if they manage their relations well, they could be the carrier of their and the increase of their constituency. However, unfortunately, instead of dealing and depending on those movements with Islamic background in the face of projects such as the Iranian project, the regime actually cracked down on those movements, but even those who came to power after the Arab Spring. Also, from my observation over 30 years on this issue, I believe the regime in Saudi Arabia sees that every regime that holds or upholds religious terms of reference or religious Islamic values regards them as a threat. So any talk about rapprochement between Iranian and Saudi regimes are only tactical moves, and also any rapprochement between the regime in Saudi Arabia and Turkey are only tactical moves, because at the end of the day there is apprehension from the point of view of the Saudi regime. There is apprehension from the political projects of Turkey and Iran, which constitute a threat to their own policy and their own authority, because should they succeed, they would threaten its own legitimacy. The other point I wanted to make is in relation to the Saudi political movement in Saudi Arabia with Islamic background. It drew my attention what you mentioned with regards to the Islamic project of the Saudi regime. I don't believe there is any, because such a project would require total independence, and the regime in Saudi Arabia lacks any form of independence. And the other issue is to talk about Mohammed bin Salman having introduced a project. But what about the project that the state have been sponsoring since the establishment of this state? Who stood up for it? What are the components of this project? So to talk about Mohammed bin Salman having let go of the Islamic project, I believe this has to be reconsidered, because from the very beginning, I don't believe there has ever been any Islamic project for the Saudi regime. But if they did not have an Islamic project, they did have an Islamic utilization. There was Islamic discourse. or rhetoric. So those three levels are different. To have a project is one thing, to utilize is another, to have an Islamic discourse is a third level in the perspective of the in Saudi Arabia. Hence, the notes by Dr. Abdullah are very important, which is this distinguishing between the Islamic project and the Islamic discourse. This is very accurate. The fourth point I wanted to make in relation to political groups or political movements with Islamic background in Saudi Arabia. As you said, the largest mobilization was related with the reactions to the advent of American troops after the invasion of Kuwait. There were papers, petitions, memos, but now after 32 years, is there a genuine, coherent political project for those Islamic movements which they can propose as an alternative for a mode of governance in the new state in Saudi Arabia, should any change take place, be it a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy, a republic, whatever. This is on the one hand, and if there is such a project or program, one of its most important elements are the political institutions. So if we have such a project, who are responsible for it, and what are the institutions that are responsible for it? Hence, what Dr. Saeed mentioned at the end of his paper are very important questions, which mean that there is much need to complement those institutional foundations and intellectual foundations for this Islamic political project. The other issue is that, do those movements have clarity on the objective, whether the main objective is to change the regime or to reform the regime in Saudi Arabia? Because there is a big difference, and if there is lack of clarity in terms of this question in particular, this has so many implications in terms of the policies, tools, and approach. So unless this question is answered very clearly, we need to reconsider. Regardless of the answer has to be clear, because if those movements agree on a change, they have an approach, and if they agree on reform, there is another approach, another problem that requires consideration. We are now talking about 12 years of the Arab Spring in neighboring countries, in the neighborhood of Saudi Arabia. The question is, how far have political movements with Islamic background benefited from that wave in the Arab Spring? Did they interact with it positively in order to make use of the lessons learned from the negative experiences, or the experiences that failed, or which they had reserve against? Did they interact with those experiences in a way that they would learn from them, from Egypt, Tunisia, Syria, Yemen, and even in Morocco, where the situation is similar in a way, or the mode of governance is similar to that in Saudi Arabia? Were they able to interact with these experiences over the past 12 years in order to manage their relations with the regime in Saudi Arabia, or with its backers, or the relations with the Islamic and liberal components and other components which may be branded as opposition opposition inside and outside Saudi Arabia? Have they interacted with them and mended their relations with them? All those questions have to be answered, remain to be answered. Thank you so much, Dr. Isam, for your remarks and for abiding by the time limit. The floor now goes to Dr. Amjad Jibril. Peace be upon you. Can you hear me? In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, I would like to start with thanking Dr. Sami Al-Aryan for inviting me to this important symposium and thanking all of the previous speakers, given that I am the last speaker who maybe not be able to add much to what my colleagues have said. I would like to summarize my comments around the relation between Saudi and Islam, between reform and future prospects. Let me take up the notes provided by Dr. Isam when he mentioned the issue of legitimacy, which is essential. I have actually 7 points to make very quickly, as also my colleagues have covered all of the things that needed to be covered. First of all, the historical aspect in studying the Islamic movement in Saudi Arabia, particularly in terms of the relation between religion and politics and its role in the very formation of the state. And I agree with the former speakers that Mohammed bin Saud, the Prince of Dir'iyya, made use of his pledge or bay'ah to Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. However, it is very important to say that although the politicians made more use of that relation, there was also the affiliation of the religious to the political. In other words, they were given institutions, and the religious institution became co-opted to the king, and it became bureaucratized, part of the formal bureaucracy of the state. The other important issue pointed out by Dr. Isam was the issue of legitimacy. The Saudi regime wanted to represent the Islamic Sunni identity, and the reason of tension with Turkey is exactly that, because Turkey constitutes another regional power with a Hanafi Islamic character that poses questions in relation to the competence and capability of the Saudi regime, although they don't say it explicitly, but the very Turkish model in itself creates tension with the Saudi regime. So anyone who would doubt the legitimacy, be it the people of the Sahwa inside Saudi or the Khomeini's revolution in Iran or in Turkey or even the Arab Spring. So the question, ever shedding a question of legitimacy on the Saudi regime, is seen as a threat to its very existence. There is also, in the perspective of the Saudi regime, they had the internal threat of the Sahwa scholars after the advent of American troops to protect Saudi Arabia. And of course, you mentioned that there was the division between the formal scholars and independent scholars, and the regime faced this with much oppression, but also gave the green light for Madkhali Salafism and its scholars the venue to spread and become stronger, giving rise to the spread of many Salafi ideas across the Islamic world and the Arab world, particularly probably in Egypt. The third point, which Dr. Isam just mentioned, which is the importance of the American factor. It is the broker variable. It is the third or unseen variable which may explain the tension or improvement of the relation between Saudi Arabia and Islamists. Of course, we haven't seen any improvement in the relation with the Islamic movement except at the time of King Faisal, and also during the Afghan war ending in 1988, where there would be common interest between the US and the Saudi regime in utilizing the Islamic movements. Apart from those instances, the relation between the Saudi regime and the Islamic movement was more stressful and tension-ridden than anything, and the Saudi regime wanted to use and utilize the jihad, the democracy, the demands, the legitimacy of those Islamic movements for its own legitimacy. Again and again, the legitimization of itself was the main obsession. And the fourth point I would like to make is that although the Saudi regime has dealt with those challenges to some extent, according to some Western writers, by managing the relation with the Islamists, with the Americans, with people inside, but it is facing increasing crises, particularly the erosion of legitimacy and the exposure of this regime to four variables. First of all, the American variable, or particularly at the time of Donald Trump, I believe that Trump has tarnished the reputation of Saudi Arabia. If you remember, in 2018, after the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, he explicitly exhorted the king, and he said that if America would not protect the Saudi regime, they would not stand for a week or two, regardless of what he meant at the time. It eroded the legitimacy of the regime. The second was Arab revolutions. Arab revolutions offered a bottom-up approach to reform, which is exactly what would erode the the legitimacy of the regime, because it is a regime based on a top-bottom approach coming from the king to the people. So, though it was inevitable for Saudi Arabia and the Saudi regime to take a stance that is anti-revolution, countering the revolution, particularly in Egypt, but also later in Syria. There is the other factor was the implications or repercussions of the intervention in Yemen, which was one of the most important variables that eroded the legitimacy of the Saudi regime. When you look at this war and the mistakes done in there, although I believe personally that this war was to install and provide legitimacy for Mohammed bin Salman, and thank God he wasn't been successful in this endeavor, and he will suffer a lot as a consequence of the Yemen war. As we witness an internal crisis in Saudi Arabia, which he tried to export to Yemen to present it as a Islamic alliance, trying to present himself as someone proposing an Islamic Arab project, so to speak. At the beginning of 2015, I believe he enjoyed acceptable Sunni legitimacy and some people actually applauded this campaign in Yemen as standing in the face of the Houthis and the Iranian influence. The fourth um, point that eroded the legitimacy of the regime was the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi. I believe that the exposure of this process of assassination, the implication of Saad al-Qahtani and other close members of the security that are close to Mohammed bin Salman, and the operation of security forces, they all presented Saudi Arabia not as a state, but something closer to an organization or outlaws, killers, and actually the justifications used by Saudi Arabia after the assassination were even more detrimental and tarnished its reputation more than the assassination itself. It seemed that the state was made of cartoon and of cardboard. The final variable, I believe, was the influence of Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, which made on Saudi Arabia, which made the small United Arab Emirates uh, in control of the much bigger Saudi Arabia, which enjoys a longer and a more uh, important and significant history than the UAE. Uh, I believe this influence caused an erosion in legitimacy, as I mentioned. In another point, I also would like to point out that the crises of governance institutions have grew a lot at the time of uh, King Salman. It looked like the background was neoliberal. It was no longer Islamic or Salafi. It was neoliberal. We have recreation, weaponization, and to have NEOM as the forefront of tourism to Saudi Arabia, uh, privatization of Aramco, and then refraining from that, and also the crisis of the vision of 2030 all show that the background was more neoliberal. Uh, and actually, neoliberalism would not save the Saudi regime. On the contrary, I believe it would create internal grudge and internal opposition for it. Another point which Dr. Yassin Akhtai made as well as Dr. Issam, which is that that the regime is concerned about regional projects, particularly Iran and Turkey, and unfortunately, this drives it to alliance with Israel. There is an Israeli writer who wrote that there is an implicit agreement between Israel's on a security level between Saudi Arabia and Israel, and also with the UAE and Bahrain, and probably the Sultanate of Oman. And this implicit security alliance is vis-a-vis Iran. And let me here elaborate a bit. Uh, yes, I might agree that Saudi Arabia does not have a regional project, but on the other hand, yes, Saudi Arabia does not have its own project. And actually, even Egypt now doesn't have a project, and even the Egypt under Mubarak had no project. Egypt under Abdel Nasser had no project. So to talk about Arab countries as being capable at all of having a regional project is an exaggeration. When I discussed my master's thesis, I was criticized for this, and my professor would tell me that my supervisor would tell me that you are playing down the magnitude and the ability of Arab states. But unfortunately, the Arab states are not states in the real sense of the word. and they are failed in many aspects. So I would agree that there is no Saudi regional project, but there is a discourse and a rhetoric, and there is utilization of politics and religion. The last thing I would like to say in relation to the war in Yemen as a determinant of the future of the regime in Saudi Arabia, I don't want to be promoting sayings that are not academic. There is an American writer who wrote Saudi-Yemeni relations. He said that Abdul Aziz told his sons that the best and worst of you are from Yemen, regardless of whether this is a myth or a real story. But at heart, it is real. At the end of the day, the war in Yemen is going to disintegrate Saudi itself because they are hitting Yemen so much that fatally, and it's going to reflect badly on them as well. The same applies to what I say about the impact of the Gaza siege on Egypt, for example. Now, with the war in Yemen, the Saudis are exposed in front of the Yemen of the Iranians and the other enemies, and in other words, this war has been weakening Saudi Arabia and eroding the legitimacy of the regime. Last of all, I would like to pose a question to Dr. Saad Al-Ghamidi and probably Dr. Saad Al-Faqih and Abdullah Al-Auda. You know the book Muted Modernizers. I would like to ask, when you mentioned that Salman al-Auda was a modernizer like Dr. and also Abdullah al-Hamid and others, and you mentioned that those are not traditional Islamists, those are modernizers. They have modernist approaches and proposals which threaten the Saudi regime. I would like to say that Saudi politics was not prosperous except in two phases during the Faisal arena and the Fahd era, sorry. And this is due to the success of King Faisal in his alliance with the religious elite and also giving a Salafi character to the state. And while King Fahd succeeded because he allied with educated Saudis who wanted to support westernizing Saudi Arabia and had a Western inclination. I believe in the following periods under King Abdullah and King Salman, I don't think there is actual cohesion within the regime. The regime does not have any support or source of legitimacy in the popular or elitist levels. I personally feel optimistic about the future of Saudi Arabia, and listening to Dr. Saad Al-Faqih and my colleagues have given me even more optimism in Saudi Arabia and the region. Thank you so much, Dr. Amjad. I would like to conclude with final comments for each speaker within 4 to 5 minutes each. I'm sorry, before you start, I will have to excuse myself because I have a lecture that starts right now, so I will have to excuse myself. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
دكتور سعد أنت muted لو تفتح
Dr. Saad, your microphone is muted. Could you please unmute your microphone?
الآن الصوت واضح؟
Can you hear me now?
التعليقات سريعة لأنه الوقت لا يسمح
Very quick comments because time does not allow for comments on each and everything that was mentioned.
لا توجد
The Saudi foreign policy has a strategy. The strategy is not written and is not drafted. Is this strategy can be discovered, and it is based on four points. The first of no religion, no homeland, and no Arabism. This is the what. This is the first point. The second point is revolving around the American policy, and this is seen according to the events that we see, and then not to have any genuine Islamic regime or anything that leads to that. For example, the money that was built to Algeria, for example, against the Islamic Salvation Front and the movement against the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, funding the coup, and other examples. So I believe all of these events prove that even if they don't get to the power, if they are getting to power, of course they will be toppled. And Mr. Isam said that they don't want any competition. Of course, this is part of the hypocrisy of the Islamic or any genuine Islamic movement will expose the hypocrisy of the Saudi regime. The final point is not to allow any project that will lead to freedom and dignity, because it will be contagious for the Gulf states sooner or later. That's why Saudi Arabia is against any of the liberation movements in the Arab Spring and before that. That's why the regime doesn't employ the Islamic movements as a strategy, because there is no national strategy. There is only strategy for maintaining the seat or the crown, and through the continuation of corruption and tyranny. Ibn Salman didn't abandon the Islamic movement. He abandoned the false cover of the Islam. I don't believe that Abdullah or any other thing said that bin Salman abandoned the Islamic project. He abandoned the false cover of Islam. The Islamic movements, in terms of the cadres and the programs, they have capabilities, but in terms of organization, we can't know that under a tyrannical regime that prosecute people for a tweet they have on a Twitter to do that. But I believe that the presence of the leadership and the cadres and the programs that are ready, this is a receipt or a recipe that is enough for those institutions to inherit the regime after its collapse. One final point, I believe that we are coming to a new culture, that there will be no culture of reforming the regime from within. There will be only one trend, which is the eliminating the regime or toppling the regime. The Islamic movement should think about getting to power. Getting to power is not something that is a shame to be ashamed of or to be embarrassed of. And now people accept blood more than others. Now the Arab governments and the Saudi government, they are prosecuting, harming, and destroying houses on the heads of people. So people now are more accepting of uh, bloodshed more than before. And even the description of any activity that it is an infidel work, or even calling people kafir or that infidel, this will be acceptable by people as well if they were described as such by the regime. Thank you very much, Dr. Saad. Now with Dr. Abdullah. Thank you very much for the enriching discussion and the presentations of the speakers.
بس يعني من المستحيل انه في 5 دقائق نعلق، لكني
It is
ساختار.
impossible in 5 minutes to comment on everything, so I will comment on two issues, which is one of the one about my father, and the other groups who are part of the Islamic, the broad Islamic current in Saudi Arabia. And there is Abdullah Al-Hamid, Ahmed Al-Hamdi, Ahmed Abdel Karim, Abdullah Al-Malki, Salman Al-Oda. They are all the results of the Islamic current, and they are part of it. But the Ihdathiyun describe them, although I have reservation in the Saudi context and in the Arab context, but she described it in English to some extent that they are improved the political discourse from the
مفهوم البيعة، مفهوم الحاكم، مفهوم الحساب،
traditional discourse about the ruled and the ruler and the custodian or wali al-amr and other concepts to more modern concepts, and that's why he called him as modernists. So this is the clarification I wanted to make. The other topic, and I believe the broader question that was asked by Dr. Aysam, was related to the lessons learned from the Arab Spring in the Saudi Arabia. I remember during the Arab Spring that Saudi Arabia, as we were the best audience for the Arab Spring, and it was a positive and negative comment, which means that we had great support on social media, and we provided a lot of support and mobilization at the time for the Arab Spring cases, but at the same time, we are audience because we did not engage in the game itself. So I believe the experience of Hassan and other experiences or the internal movement, whether in Breda or other areas, and the demonstrations in King Khalid Street, there were some attempts. I believe, in my own humble assessment, maybe the most important lesson from the Arab Spring is to make it harder for our adversaries to put us under one category or one group, or try to make to create a inclusive national discourse that includes different groups, different ethnicities or backgrounds, in order to stop anybody who wants to label us as Islamists, so we can be targeted or we can be easily attacked. So we should not forget the larger segment of our society, which is conservative society, and we are all trying to achieve that. We may fail, we may succeed, but from what happened in Egypt, there were internal forces as well as international forces that tried to create the enmity between the Muslim Brotherhood and another current that they called a civil current. Uh, uh, on the other hand, in Tunisia, or although the experience is no more the experience that we were looking at highly after Qais Said, but in Tunisia managed to go beyond this dichotomy that Muslims against the liberals or seculars. Some of the things that were influential for me, a research that was written by Nadia Al-Marzouqi. She is the daughter of Mr. Al-Munsaf Al-Marzouqi, the first elected president after the revolution in Tunisia. She spoke how the political condition in Tunisia after the revolution didn't start after the resolution. After the revolution, it was the result of the revolution, but it started in diaspora by opening large spaces for the opposition in the diaspora, and it engaged with the condition or the situation inside Tunisia. These are my comments. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Dr. Abdullah. And now we do go to Dr. Saeed bin Nasser Al-Ghamidi. I would like to express my gratitude again for this meeting and for this rich discussion.
الخلاصات التي أنا بنفسي دونتها
and the
لنفسي.
conclusions that I have made myself from what I heard from the keynote speakers or the commenters.
أريد أن أعقب به في هذا الشأن.
What I want to comment on in this regard, regardless that whether the regime has legitimacy or not, but in reality, it is working just like the shabut fish when it is moving within the net. The more it moves, the more it will be trapped in the net. So that's what the regime is getting into without any rational thinking or any logic. Of course, the religious issues are a mere veneer for deceiving people, but the structural problem within the regime against the country and against the people in the country is a chronic problem, and it is represented that the king or the person at the top of the hierarchy is the only one who orders everything and decides everything, and whatever he says should be obeyed, and no one uh, revise with him anything, and they don't even accept a tweet or any call, like for example Dr. Yasin or anything, and the only thing that they accept is their own voice, even from the people around them or surrounding them. We know that he uh,
في بعض القضايا وبعض
eliminated some of the people around him or some of the ministers because they rejected some of his policies, including some of the security personnel or military personnel. They were removed because of that. So the regime is extremist in its orientation or in its dependency on one person. This is detrimental for the regime, and it will make it uh, lose its position soon. So the regime or Bin Salman, who managed to label important figures of the family with corruption, and he arrested them, he took their money, and maybe he was honest in that when he said that they took the money from the treasury of the country, but the money was stolen by different hands of the family, and now they are in the hands of one thief only. Thank you very much. Thank you. And the final word will be with Dr. Yasin. Thank you very much first for this symposium, and thanks for the comments of the brothers. So what I want to add is to thank you because I benefited from this panel. Dr. Isam Abdel Shafi talked about in the employing Islam. This word is not a good word. Because our belief in Islam is not something that is not employed, but that's what some politicians do, that they employ something or some of the religion without strong belief in it. Sometimes we see that in the internal or foreign domestic or foreign policies. Look at, for example, Russia now, how they are using the orthodox belief and separating or attacking another country. But there are a lot of interests, and anybody who believes they can use Islam, we can't accuse anyone who is using the narrative or the discourse of Islam that they are employing it or using it without strong belief. Of course, we need to look at the results. And when we see that
كل الأشخاص يختلفوا عن بعضهم بعض، والآن السياسة التي يريد أن يرفع راية
people are different from each other,
الإسلام المعتدل هو
and those who are using the slogan of the moderate Islam, they are employing or creating a new kind of Islam. They are deforming Islam first, and those who are using this word, the moderate Islam, their only interest is to use Islam or to employ Islam in such a way for their own interests and not for the interests of Islam itself.
السياسي. وكما أشار إليه أستاذ سعد الفقيه،
And
يعني
as Mr. Saad al-Faqih said,
الإسلام في المملكة، في سياسة المملكة الدين والوطن ولا أي شيء.
in the policy of the kingdom, they are not interested in religion or homeland or Arabism. The only thing that is important for them is the throne. And so this is a secular rule.
المانية من ناحية طبعا، وطبعا ولكن مع ذلك هو في كلمته أيضا أشار إلى
However,
شيء آخر،
in his word as well, or in his remarks, he said,
من ناحية علم الاجتماع طبعا عندما يقول
in terms of the sociology, when he said that
التي هي كأنها هي قدر، يعني
the family or the monarchy as if it is a fate for the people who live in a kingdom, and they come with the tradition and with everything that in terms of politics, people think that this is the fate that is ordained by God himself.
الرؤية. والآن بعد في من يتحدث عن آل السعود، الآن بدأت آل سلمان يعني.
And now some people are saying that bin Salman destroyed this vision, and now instead of talking about the Saud family, now we are talking about the Salman family only.
طبعا لا نريد إلا الخير
Of course, we hope that all the good things happen to the entire Ummah, and we pray to the Allah the Almighty that the policies of all the countries and all the peoples will lead to the good of those people and the good for the Ummah. Thank you again, and peace be upon you. Thank you all indeed, Dr. Yassine from Istanbul, Dr. Saad Al Faqih from London, Dr. Abdullah Al Auda from Washington, Dr. Said bin Nasser in London as well, and Dr. Isam Abdel Shafi and Mr. Amjad Jibril. Thank you all for your comments. First, I would like to apologize from the Arabic channel. There was a problem in the in the sound, but we have the recording, so we are going to upload it on YouTube after a few minutes from the session, and everybody can listen to it, because this was a really rich symposium. With this symposium, we will finish the fifth symposium and in this series. And from the Friday to today, we talked about the Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi. The next week, we are going to speak about Libya, Algeria, and Morocco. Thank you very much indeed.